Snow drifted through the streets of Sandpoint, swirling like lost time. Outside a small cafe, an elderly couple stood trembling in the storm. Two silhouettes against the white, their coats heavy with frost, their hands gripping worn canes. No one looked up. Inside, a Navy SEAL sat alone, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. Beside him, his German shepherd lifted its head, ears forward, eyes fixed on the door, as if sensing something his handler had forgotten how to feel. What happened when those eyes met would change all three of them forever. Because sometimes, miracles don't come with angels. They come with veterans and loyal dogs. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The morning light over Sandpoint, Idaho, came pale and reluctant, filtering weakly through a sky heavy with snow. The storm hadn't stopped for 2 days, and the streets were now a hushed expanse of white, broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing truck and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. The air had that sharp, metallic cold that made each breath visible, and even the harbor lay still beneath a skin of ice. The town looked as though it had forgotten motion. At the far end of Main Street stood the Harbor Lane Cafe, its windows fogged and glowing with soft amber light. The scent of roasted beans and maple syrup drifted faintly outside whenever the door opened, a small comfort to anyone brave enough to step through the storm. That morning, 2 elderly figures stood by the entrance, uncertain whether to do just that. Walter Elliston, 84, leaned heavily on a wooden cane, polished smooth by decades of use. He was tall once, broad-shouldered, but time had folded his posture forward. His face, lined deep with years of work and worry, was the color of old parchment, and his eyes, pale blue, weary, yet alert, carried a stubborn spark that refused to dim. Beneath his coat, frayed at the cuffs, he wore a wool sweater that had belonged to his father. The hem was unraveling, but it still kept him warm. Beside him, June Elliston clutched her husband's arm for balance. She was smaller, a delicate frame wrapped in a faded navy overcoat, the kind once fashionable in the 1950s. Her hair, a soft silver, escaped from beneath her knitted hat in thin wisps that fluttered in the wind. Her gloved hands trembled, not just from cold, but from exhaustion. The world had grown too fast, too loud, and she no longer trusted her strength to keep up. The couple had been walking for nearly an hour, their boots sinking into the thick snow, leaving shallow, uneven prints that the wind erased behind them. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the small house that used to be their home, or what was left of it, the shouting, the slammed doors, the words from their grandson Colin that still echoed in Walter's mind, words sharp enough to pierce deeper than winter's chill. He had always believed family was a place of refuge, not exile. He was wrong. Maybe we shouldn't, June murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. We can find another place. Walter looked through the cafe window. The warm light pooled across the tables, where strangers laughed, sipped coffee, and checked their phones. He saw no empty table. He saw no familiar face. Still, the cold pressed so deep into his bones that his pride began to lose its footing. Just for a moment, he said quietly, to get warm. Inside the cafe, the world felt different. Closer, calmer. The air carried the sweet heaviness of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee. The wooden floors creaked under every step, and the walls, lined with black and white photos of Sandpoint in earlier days, seemed to hum with the memory of better winters. A radio played low in the background, an old country song that spoke of roads and redemption. At the back table near the window sat Ethan Cole, 38, shoulders squared, back straight even in stillness. He was the kind of man people glanced at twice, once to note the quiet confidence, and again to wonder what kind of life carved such restraint into a face. His hair was short and dark, with a streak of gray beginning to claim the sides. A thin scar ran from his jawline to just beneath his ear, a reminder of a place he didn't talk about anymore. Ethan had served as a Navy SEAL for 15 years. Combat zones, foreign lands, endless missions that blurred into each other. He'd seen the world's beauty and its brutality layered together, and both had left marks. Since returning home, he hadn't found peace, only quiet. He carried it with him, like a backpack full of stones, heavy but invisible to anyone else. At his feet lay Shadow, a 4-year-old German shepherd, broad and lean, his black and tan fur brushed to a sheen. His amber eyes were sharp, intelligent, and always moving. He was trained to respond to danger before it arrived, to sense fear before it became visible. But here, in this small cafe, Shadow rested with the calm of a soldier off duty. His head lay across his front paws, ears twitching to the rhythm of the room's sounds, the scrape of a chair, the hiss of the espresso machine, the steady fall of snow outside. Ethan turned the mug of black coffee in his hands. The heat had long faded, but he wasn't drinking it for warmth. He was drinking it for the illusion of normalcy, a ritual he could still control. When he exhaled, his breath fogged faintly against the window pane. At the counter, Sarah Green, the barista, hummed softly as she refilled cups. She was in her late 20s, tall, with freckles scattered across her fair skin and chestnut hair tied loosely behind her neck. There was kindness in her face, an openness that hadn't yet been worn down by cynicism. Still, she moved with the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen too many winter mornings start the same way. Customers rushing in for comfort, leaving behind tips that barely paid the rent. It was Sarah who noticed them first, the two shapes outside the door, blurred by frost and distance. She paused, towel in hand, watching as Walter leaned against the frame, his cane slipping slightly on the icy steps. June's other hand reached to steady him, her fingers trembling. Ethan saw her pause. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Sarah blinked and shook her head. "Just people outside. Looks cold." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the window. Two figures stood there in the storm, motionless, fragile as paper. A faint memory stirred. A checkpoint overseas. The silhouettes of civilians waiting for help that never came. He looked away, jaw tightening. They'll come in if they need to. But Shadow lifted his head. The dog's ears pricked forward, muscles subtly tensing beneath his coat. His amber eyes fixed on the door, unblinking. A low, uncertain whine escaped him. A sound not of fear, but of recognition. "What is it?" Ethan asked under his breath. Shadow didn't move, only stared harder. Outside, Walter hesitated, watching the snow swirl around his wife's boots. "I'll open it," he murmured. June nodded, though her lips were pale. She wanted to protest again, to suggest turning back, but her legs ached and her breath came short. Somewhere behind the glass, warmth waited. For one small moment, she let herself imagine it was the same warmth their house used to hold, the one Colin's shouting had driven out long ago. Walter reached for the door handle, the leather of his glove stiff from cold. The metal stung his palm as he gripped it. Inside, Shadow shifted his weight, rising slowly to his feet. Ethan frowned at the sudden alertness. The door creaked. A burst of wind rushed through, scattering napkins from the counter and pulling heat out of the room. Conversations faltered. The radio's low hum seemed to fade beneath the gust. Snowflakes tumbled through the open doorway, clinging to coats and hair and the edges of wooden tables. June stepped in first, guided by Walter's arm. The storm had turned her cheeks the color of faded roses. Droplets glimmered along her hat like pearls. She blinked at the brightness of the cafe, the hum of voices, the sudden, impossible comfort of warmth. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Sarah set her towel down, watching them with soft concern. A few customers turned their heads, some curious, others merely inconvenienced. But Shadow didn't look away. The German shepherd's eyes locked on the couple, his tail lowering slightly as his ears tipped forward. It wasn't aggression. It was awareness. The kind that came from instincts sharpened by countless missions, by learning to recognize the wounded even when they tried to hide it. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. He saw them, two figures barely standing, their coats soaked through, their faces etched with quiet defeat. Something stirred deep within him, something that had been asleep for far too long. Then the door swung fully open with a second gust of wind. The napkins fluttered again. The lights flickered once, and the smell of snow filled the cafe. Shadow took a single step forward, eyes unwavering, his entire focus pinned on the couple by the door, as if he had recognized them before Ethan ever did. For a few seconds after the wind died down, the Harbor Lane Cafe felt like a photograph, every sound suspended, every movement held. The elderly couple stood by the door, blinking against the sudden warmth and light. Snow melted from their coats, leaving dark patches that spread like ink stains. The room slowly exhaled. Conversations resumed. Chairs scraped faintly across the wooden floor, and a young man near the window returned to typing on his laptop. But the hush that had briefly fallen didn't fade completely. It lingered, as if the cafe itself had drawn a quiet breath and refused to let it go. Walter Elliston guided his wife forward. "Let's just ask," he murmured. June nodded, her hand tightening on his arm. Her lips were pale, trembling faintly, and the way she leaned into him told more than her words ever could. Together they moved between tables, passing strangers who smiled politely before turning away. Near the counter, Lydia, the younger of the two servers, watched with a curious mix of empathy and hesitation. She was 25, petite and light-footed, with copper-red hair tied up beneath a navy headband. Her cheeks carried the natural blush of someone unused to makeup, and her green eyes darted between the couple and the rest of the room. Lydia had started working at the cafe only a few months earlier, after moving from Spokane to escape what she called a life that didn't fit anymore. She'd once been a music student, but bills had taught her different lessons. Still, there was a gentleness in her that hadn't been worn away yet, the kind that made her linger a few seconds longer than others might when someone looked lost. June stopped at the nearest table where two young women sat with steaming cups of mocha and open sketchbooks. "Excuse me," June said softly, her voice almost apologetic. "Would it be all right if we, just for a minute, sat here?" The girls exchanged a glance, awkward smiles freezing on their lips. One shook her head quickly, mumbling, "Sorry, we're waiting for someone." June gave a tiny nod, as if she had expected that. She turned to move away, but the motion cost her balance. Her cane slipped slightly on the damp floor. Walter reached out too late, and for a terrifying instant, her weight tilted backward. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan was already on his feet. His chair slid back with a soft scrape. In 3 steady strides, he crossed the room, one hand catching June's elbow, the other supporting her shoulder. "Got you," he said, his voice low but firm. His grip was strong, the kind that steadied rather than startled. June blinked up at him, startled by the sudden presence of this tall stranger, whose gray eyes seemed both sharp and kind at once. Shadow moved too, quietly, instinctively. The German shepherd rose from his place beneath the table and padded forward, stopping just beside June's leg. His tail was low, but wagged once, the gesture small, but reassuring. Ethan adjusted his hold so June could regain her footing. "You all right, ma'am?" June nodded, breath catching, just dizzy for a moment. Walter cleared his throat, his pride flickering in the space between gratitude and embarrassment. "We didn't mean to cause trouble." "No trouble," Ethan said. He turned his head slightly, speaking not as an offer, but as a certainty. "You can sit here." He nudged his own chair aside and pulled another from a nearby table. For a heartbeat, Walter hesitated. Decades of quiet dignity warred with the simple need for rest. Then he nodded once, voice low. "Thank you, son." Ethan said nothing more. He waited until they were both seated, then signaled subtly to Lydia, who was already approaching with 2 extra mugs. Lydia set them down gently. "Something warm?" she asked. "Tea, if you have it," June said. "Just plain." Lydia smiled, the corners of her mouth softening. Coming right up, she looked toward Ethan. "You want me to refresh your coffee?" "Please," he said. When she walked away, Walter glanced toward the dog sitting by June's feet. "He's a fine animal," Walter said, his tone cautious but admiring. "Shadow," Ethan replied. 4 years old, retired early. June bent slightly, extending a trembling hand. "Retired? Like you, then?" she asked, her voice tinged with a fragile humor. Ethan's lips curved, but only slightly. "Something like that?" Shadow tilted his head, sniffing June's glove, before resting his chin lightly near her boot. June smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the fur between his ears. For the first time in hours, the cold in her chest began to thaw. Across the cafe, Sarah Green, the older barista from earlier, glanced over from behind the espresso machine. She was refilling a jar of sugar, but her attention flicked back to the table where Ethan sat with the 2 newcomers. She had seen enough lonely people to recognize the signs, how they sat too small, too polite, too careful, as though occupying space required permission. She made a note to check if they needed food once the rush slowed down. Walter removed his hat, revealing a crown of thin white hair. He set it carefully on his knee, eyes drifting toward the window. Snow still fell outside, relentless, the weight of it pressed against the glass, muffling the world beyond. "We didn't think it'd come down this hard," he said quietly. Ethan followed his gaze. "Storm came early this year," he said. "People weren't ready." Walter gave a dry laugh. "Seems to be a theme these days." June's hand found her husband's beneath the table, fingers curling around his. Ethan didn't ask what they were doing out in that weather, yet something in his posture shifted, the soldier's alertness softening into human concern. He had seen pain masked behind politeness before. Lydia returned with the tea, steam curling gently from the cups. "Careful, it's hot," she said, setting them down. She lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. June met her eyes and smiled, a small, grateful thing. Lydia saw the faint tremor in the woman's hands and wanted to ask if she was all right, but the words caught behind her throat. Instead, she said softly, "If you need anything else, I'll be right over there." "Thank you, dear," June replied. When Lydia walked away, Ethan noticed the subtle way June turned her wrist as she lifted the cup. It was a small motion, but practiced, the movement of someone accustomed to hiding pain. The sleeve of her coat slipped down slightly, just for a moment, long enough for him to see the edge of a dark mark running along her skin, shaped not like a fall or a bruise from age, but the deep oval imprint left by fingers that had gripped too tightly. June caught him looking and tugged her sleeve back quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clumsy, that's all," she said quietly, as though reading his thoughts. "Fell last week." Ethan didn't reply. Years of field experience had taught him to tell when someone was lying, not maliciously, but out of habit, out of fear. He glanced toward Shadow, who was now resting at June's feet again. The dog's ears had lowered slightly, eyes half closed, yet his body stayed alert in that subtle, trained way, tense but still. Walter sipped his tea without noticing the exchange. "Been coming through this town since before they paved Main Street," he said. "Didn't used to be so busy." Ethan nodded absently, though his focus lingered on June's trembling hands. He remembered missions where people's stories hid behind gestures, not words. Signs of bruises they swore were accidents, of fear that wore politeness like armor. The cafe felt suddenly smaller, the warmth sharper. Sarah passed by and refilled his cup without asking. "New friends?" she said quietly. Ethan's reply was simple. "Maybe." When Sarah left, he looked back at the couple. June sat very still, staring into the cup, as though searching for answers in the tea leaves. Walter reached across and patted her hand. "It's good to sit again," he said softly, "just for a minute." June smiled faintly, but Ethan saw her knuckles whiten. Outside, the storm deepened, snow swirling against the window like restless ghosts. And there, beneath the table, Shadow's amber eyes flicked open. The dog looked first at Ethan, then at June, then back again, watchful, protective, understanding something unspoken. Ethan followed his gaze. The faint bruises on June's wrist told him this wasn't just about shelter from the cold. Something else had followed them here, something invisible but heavy. He didn't know yet what it was, only that he couldn't look away. The clock above the counter ticked once, soft but clear. June's sleeve slipped again as she reached for the sugar jar, and the bruise caught the light. Ethan's hand stilled on his mug. She froze, realizing what he'd seen. "It's nothing," she whispered. But Ethan knew better. The snow outside had thickened into a steady white curtain, blurring the shapes of the town into soft silhouettes. From inside the Harbor Lane Cafe, the storm looked almost peaceful, but the air around the small table near the window had grown heavy, thick with things unsaid. Ethan sat back in his chair, one hand loosely around his coffee mug, the other resting on his knee near Shadow's leash. Across from him, June stirred her tea without drinking, the spoon tapping gently against the porcelain in an absent rhythm. Walter sat rigid, his cane leaning against the table, his knuckles pale from the grip that kept him steady. The bruise on June's wrist still lingered in Ethan's thoughts. It wasn't just a mark. It was the silence that followed his noticing it, a silence that wasn't defensive, but fearful. He had seen that kind before. It was the silence of someone who had learned that truth invited punishment. A soft voice broke through the tension. "You're kind to let us sit," Walter said, not quite meeting Ethan's eyes. "Most folks these days don't have much patience for old bones like ours." Ethan shrugged slightly. "Doesn't take much to be decent," he said. His tone was even, though his gaze remained observant. Years of training had conditioned him to notice details. The way Walter's right hand trembled when he reached for his cup, or how June flinched every time someone laughed too loudly from the far side of the room. Shadow shifted beneath the table, letting out a quiet exhale. The dog's body tensed just enough for Ethan to notice. He followed Shadow's attention toward the front counter, where the bell above the door jingled, and a man in a heavy gray coat stepped in from the cold. The newcomer was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a weathered face that spoke of long days outdoors. His beard was rough and untrimmed, flecked with gray, and his eyes carried a watchfulness that came from habit rather than hostility. He brushed snow from his coat and nodded toward Sarah at the counter. "Coffee. Black," he said simply. His voice was gravelly, deep, the kind that suggested a smoker or someone used to shouting over wind. Sarah, professional as always, smiled politely and began pouring. Ethan glanced back at Shadow, who had relaxed again. He wasn't sure why the dog had reacted, but he trusted that instinct. He always did. Shadow had learned to read tension faster than any human could. Walter followed Ethan's gaze for a moment, then lowered his voice. "He reminds me of our grandson," he said quietly. Ethan turned back, unsure whether Walter meant the man at the counter or the dog. "Your grandson?" June's spoon stilled. Walter hesitated, the lines around his mouth tightening. He looked at June, then sighed as though deciding something. "We weren't going to talk about it," he said softly. "But maybe we should." Ethan said nothing. He'd learned the value of silence in getting people to speak. Walter rubbed his hands together, his voice trembling slightly. "His name's Colin Elliston. He's 45 now. Big man, smart once. Maybe too smart for his own good. He was supposed to take care of us after his mother passed." Walter's eyes went distant. "Said he'd help with the house, the bills. We thought it was kindness. But kindness turns sharp when money's involved." June's gaze stayed on her cup. "He said we owed him," she whispered. "Said we were lucky he didn't put us somewhere else." Lydia, passing nearby with a tray, hesitated for a second when she heard June's tone. She glanced toward Ethan, uncertain, then continued on quietly, leaving them privacy. Walter's fingers drummed against the table. He took control of everything: bank accounts, the deed, the phone. Said it was easier that way. But easier for who? His jaw tightened, a flicker of anger surfacing before he swallowed it down. When we asked about the bills, he said not to worry. When we wanted to see the neighbors, he said they were too busy. Before long, we stopped asking. Ethan's stomach twisted in quiet recognition. He had seen domination like this before, control disguised as care, isolation wrapped in the language of love. "And last night?" he asked. Walter nodded slowly. "He was drinking again. Storm rolled in, and he said he didn't want us costing him more electricity. Called it dead weight." His eyes darkened. "I told him he'd regret speaking that way to his elders. He didn't like that." June's voice cracked. He threw a mug. It shattered near the fire. Her fingers touched the edge of the bruise unconsciously. He told us to leave if we didn't like how things were run. Walter's voice dropped to a rasp. So we left, with what we could carry. The cafe hummed quietly around them, the low sound of life continuing, unaware of the storm that existed at their table. Ethan's jaw flexed as he stared at the snow outside. He'd fought wars overseas and seen men destroy families for power, but the cruelty in this story felt different. Smaller, pettier, but somehow more vile for being domestic. Shadow's ears twitched again. He had shifted position slightly, placing himself so that his body now angled between the couple and the main walkway. It wasn't aggressive, just instinct. Protective. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight and noticed a group of customers entering, stamping snow from their boots. One of them, a man in his early 30s with dark hair and a patchy beard, laughed too loudly. The sound made June startle. Shadow's tail stiffened. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's collar, murmuring, "Easy, boy." The door closed again, muting the outside world. Lydia approached once more, setting down a plate with 2 slices of pie. "On the house," she said with a gentle smile. "Something warm helps." June's lips quivered as she smiled back. "That's very kind, dear." Lydia hesitated, lowering her voice. "You folks from around here?" Walter nodded. "Born and raised." Her brow furrowed. "Thought so. You look familiar. You used to come to the hardware store, right?" Walter blinked. "Years ago, maybe." Lydia smiled faintly. "My dad ran the counter then. Said you built half the houses near Elm Street." Walter chuckled softly, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Built a few roofs that still don't leak." Lydia lingered a second longer, reading something unspoken in their posture, the exhaustion that came from more than cold weather. "If you need anything else, I'm around," she said, then quietly returned to the counter. Ethan leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "You said he controls the bank accounts?" Walter nodded. "Everything. My pension, June's insurance. I couldn't even buy her new shoes without asking." June tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "He says it's for our protection." "From what?" Ethan asked. Walter looked up, and for the first time, Ethan saw anger burn beneath the man's restraint. "From living free," he said simply. Shadow shifted again, his body tightening slightly. Ethan noticed the way the dog's eyes tracked toward the front door once more. He heard it this time. The faint sound of heavy boots crunching outside before pausing just beyond the glass. The shape beyond the fogged window was blurred, motionless, but large. A prickle moved along Ethan's neck. Years of service had taught him to listen to the smallest warnings, the hesitation before a threat steps forward. The cafe's warmth suddenly felt fragile. The door handle twitched slightly before stilling. Whoever was outside hadn't decided whether to enter. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to Shadow's collar. "Stay," he murmured. The dog's muscles went rigid but silent, eyes fixed on the window. Walter followed his gaze. "What is it?" "Probably nothing," Ethan said softly, though his body remained coiled. Outside, the blurred shadow moved away, swallowed again by the storm. Only then did Ethan's shoulders ease a fraction. He met Walter's eyes. "You said he threw you out last night. Does he know you came here?" Walter hesitated. "He knows everything." That answer sat heavy between them. Shadow finally lay back down, but his eyes stayed open. The rhythm of his breathing matched the slow, steady beat of Ethan's heart. Controlled, but alert. Ethan knew 2 things then. The storm outside wasn't the only danger closing in. and the old couple sitting across from him couldn't fight it alone for much longer. The storm had softened by late afternoon, but the sky remained the color of ash. Flakes still drifted in lazy spirals, landing quietly on windshields and melting into the slush below. The Harbor Lane Cafe had thinned out. The chatter that once filled the room was now replaced by the muted hum of the heater and the occasional clink of cups being stacked for closing. Ethan sat still for a moment longer, watching the snow cling to the window pane, his thoughts moving slower than usual. Across from him, Walter and June Elliston finished the last of their tea, both too polite to admit how long they had been sitting there. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, eyes half closed, but far from asleep. His ears twitched at every shuffle, every shift of a chair. When Lydia passed by with her tray, the dog's head tilted briefly before settling again. "Storm's not getting better," Sarah said as she approached their table, wiping her hands on her apron. The soft lines around her eyes deepened when she smiled. "You folks sure you want to be heading out?" Ethan looked up at her. "We'll manage," he said evenly. "They shouldn't be out in this any longer." Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the old couple. There was something about June's fragile posture and Walter's stoic silence that unsettled her. "If you need a place to stay, there's a bed and breakfast 2 streets over," she offered. "The owner's a widow, Mrs. Dawson. Sweet woman. Runs it quiet. Might have a room open." Walter shook his head, forcing a thin smile. "Appreciate it, miss, but we don't have much left to pay with." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan cut in gently. "I'll handle it," he said, pulling a few bills from his wallet and leaving them beneath the coffee mug. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Walter's protest died in his throat. The quiet authority in Ethan's tone made refusal feel out of place. Outside, the air bit sharp against their faces. The snow squeaked under their boots as they crossed the parking lot. The cafe's neon sign flickered behind them, its glow swallowed by the encroaching dusk. Ethan led the way to his truck. A dark, weather-worn Ford that looked as though it had survived as much as he had. The bed was dusted with frost, and the engine groaned when he turned the key, coughing twice before settling into a low hum. "Climb in," Ethan said, opening the passenger door. Shadow hopped into the back seat first, his paws leaving wet prints on the leather. Walter helped June climb up, careful with her coat hem so it wouldn't snag. Ethan adjusted the heat dial and waited until the defroster began to push warm air through the vents before shifting into gear. The roads out of Sandpoint were slick and narrow, winding between pine trees that bent under the weight of snow. The headlights carved tunnels through the gray light, illuminating the faint glimmer of ice on the asphalt. Shadow sat alert in the back, his head between the front seats, nose twitching occasionally as if cataloging scents through the half-open window. June clasped her hands tightly on her lap, eyes fixed on the snowy road ahead. "We're troubling you, aren't we?" she said softly. Ethan glanced over. "You're not," he said. "No one should be left out there." Walter cleared his throat. "You sound like a man who's seen worse." Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Maybe," he replied. The single word carried more truth than explanation. They drove in silence for several minutes. The rhythm of the wipers against the windshield was steady, hypnotic. Snowflakes streaked through the beam of light like falling stars. Then Shadow moved. His ears rose, his body stiffening slightly. A faint growl vibrated in his chest, low and uncertain. Ethan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Headlights glowed faintly in the distance, 2 points of yellow slowly gaining on them. The truck behind them didn't sway or speed. It followed with precision, staying far enough back to seem casual, but close enough to be deliberate. "Someone behind us," Ethan murmured. Walter turned, squinting through the frosted rear window. "Can't see much in this weather." June's hand went instinctively to her husband's sleeve. "Do you think it's—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Ethan didn't need her to. The fear in her voice filled in the name, Colin. He pressed his foot lightly on the gas, testing the response. The Ford accelerated just enough to stretch the distance. The headlights behind them mirrored the motion, closing the gap again with quiet persistence. Shadow's fur bristled along his spine. His amber eyes locked on the glow behind them, pupils narrowing. Ethan's jaw set. "Stay calm," he said. June's breathing quickened. "He wouldn't follow us, would he?" Walter's silence was answer enough. The town's lights faded behind them as they entered the darker stretch of County Road 12. The snow fell heavier now, thick flakes spinning like ash through the beams. Ethan's focus sharpened. His training took over, calculating distance, terrain, escape routes. The truck's tires crunched over the icy road, and every sound outside felt amplified. The whine of wind, the creak of the steering column, the heartbeat of pursuit. Walter shifted in his seat, peering through the side mirror. "Gray pickup," he said, voice hoarse. "That's his." June's hands flew to her mouth. "Dear God." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "He can follow," he said quietly, "but he won't touch you." The headlights behind them flashed once, long enough to confirm intent, not communication. Ethan's pulse slowed, steady, trained to handle crisis with clarity. He guided the Ford onto a side route leading toward the old logging road, one that looped through the forest before reconnecting to the main highway. It would be narrow and unplowed, but defensible. Shadow turned to look out the rear window, muscles taut. A low growl slipped again from his throat, more certain this time. "Good boy," Ethan murmured. "Keep eyes on him." Behind them, Colin's gray pickup roared as he shifted gears, his fury translating into motion. Inside that vehicle, Colin Elliston gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white. His face, once handsome in a rough laborer's way, was red with anger. His sandy brown hair clung damp to his forehead, and the stubble on his jaw made him look even more unkempt. The scar above his right eyebrow, a souvenir from a drunken fight years ago, flared with color whenever his temper rose. He muttered curses under his breath, eyes locked on the faint red taillights ahead. He couldn't believe his grandparents had gone running to a stranger, airing family matters like some public shame. "Think you can just walk away, old man?" he growled. The words fogged the windshield. He pressed harder on the gas. The tires fishtailed briefly before catching traction again. Ethan noticed the pickup closing in. "Hang on," he said, voice even but sharp. He steered into the narrower road, the truck jolting over ruts beneath the snow. Pines crowded close on either side, their branches forming dark walls. Walter's cane rattled against the door. "Where does this go?" "Old logging route," Ethan said. "Not far." Shadow shifted forward, front paws on the console now. The German shepherd's breath fogged the window, his ears rotating like radar. The gray pickup stayed on their tail, its headlights bouncing in and out of view between the trees. The roar of its engine echoed unnaturally through the forested pass. Ethan slowed briefly to navigate a curve And that was when the pickup surged ahead. It swung wide, sliding across the icy road before jerking to a stop sideways in front of them. Tires screeched against packed snow. Ethan hit the brakes, the Ford skidding to a halt only yards away. Colin stepped out, slamming the door behind him. The cold wind whipped his coat open, revealing a flannel shirt stained near the collar. His breath came out in hard bursts. The anger in his eyes burned through the snow's haze. "Stay inside," Ethan said calmly to Walter and June. He opened the door, boots sinking into the snow. Shadow followed, jumping down beside him, every hair along his back standing upright. Colin's voice cut through the storm. "You think you can take what's mine?" Ethan didn't answer yet. He let the silence stretch, the wind filling the space between them. Inside the truck, June's tears slipped silently down her cheeks as Walter gripped her hand. He had seen this look in Colin's eyes before, but never with a stranger standing in his path. Ethan stepped forward, posture composed, eyes steady. The air between the two men felt charged, like the seconds before lightning finds ground. The confrontation had arrived. Wind screamed through the trees, carrying snow that moved sideways across the empty stretch of road. The gray pickup sat broadside ahead, its headlights cutting twin cones through the storm. Ethan's Ford idled in the center of the narrow path, the exhaust curling upward in ghostly plumes. Between the two vehicles, the world was reduced to shades of white, steel, and breath. Ethan stepped forward, his boots crunching into the ice, Shadow pacing silently at his heel. Colin Elliston stood beside his truck, shoulders heaving beneath a thick flannel coat that strained at the seams. Snow gathered in his unkempt hair and beard, but he didn't seem to feel it. His eyes, bloodshot and bright with fury, locked on the figures inside Ethan's vehicle, on the silhouettes of Walter and June huddled close together. "You've got no right taking them," he shouted, his voice roughened by whiskey and rage. Ethan's reply came calm, measured. "They're not property." "Property?" Colin barked out a laugh that ended as a snarl. "Everything I've done was for them. The bills, the house, the food on their table. You think I'm the bad guy because they spun you a story?" He took a half step forward, snow sloshing beneath his boots. "They're old. They forget things. They lie when it suits them." Ethan didn't move. His breath came slow, controlled, his pulse steady even as adrenaline burned quietly beneath the surface. "Old doesn't mean foolish," he said, "and I've seen enough to know what fear looks like." Behind him, the truck door opened. Walter's voice, tremulous but firm, carried over the wind. "Colin, enough. You've done more harm than help." Colin's face twisted. "I gave you everything," he roared. "You'd be freezing to death without me." He jabbed a finger toward Ethan. "And who's he? Some stranger you dragged in to feel sorry for you?" Ethan didn't answer, but Shadow's posture changed. The German shepherd's tail dropped, his head lowered, ears forward. A warning growl rippled through his chest. Low, steady, the kind that spoke more clearly than words. Colin flinched, but covered it with a sneer. "You got your dog trained to threaten people now?" Ethan's voice hardened. "Only when they need to be." Colin laughed again, but the sound came out thin. His confidence was crumbling under the weight of something he didn't understand. Ethan's composure, the dog's unwavering gaze, and the quiet strength that now stood behind them. Walter had stepped from the truck, his old cane sinking into the snow. His face, lined with age and exhaustion, carried an expression Colin hadn't seen in years. Defiance. "Son," Walter said, his voice shaking not from fear, but from conviction. You stopped caring the day you started counting what you could take. Colin's jaw clenched. You ungrateful. He lunged forward. The motion was sudden, fueled by months of resentment and too much liquor. Ethan shifted instantly, placing himself between Colin and the couple. Stop. The single word was a command, flat and immovable, but Colin didn't. He reached past Ethan's shoulder, grabbing for June's arm as she tried to step back. His fingers brushed her coat, then Shadow moved. The dog launched forward with a bark that cracked the storm open. Snow burst upward around his paws as he landed squarely between Colin and June, hackles raised, fangs bared in warning but not attack. The sound that came from him was deep and resonant, vibrating through the air. Colin stumbled backward, slipping on the ice, his coat whipping in the wind. Ethan's tone stayed even. He won't bite unless I tell him to, he said quietly. But I wouldn't test that. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind and Colin's ragged breathing. He stared at Shadow, whose eyes glowed amber beneath the truck's headlights. Then his gaze snapped back to Ethan. You think you can protect them forever? You don't know who you're dealing with. Ethan stepped closer, his own shadow merging with the dog's. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, he said. A bully who mistook fear for respect. Colin's hand curled into a fist, then fell open again. The reality of the situation, the calm, unflinching man before him, the trained animal standing guard, finally broke through the haze of his anger. He spat into the snow, the dark spot hissing against the ice. This isn't over. Walter stood a few feet behind Ethan, clutching his cane. For the first time in years, he felt the fragile thrill of being defended. His heart pounded against his ribs, but the weight pressing on his chest wasn't fear. It was something closer to relief. June reached for her husband's sleeve. Please, she whispered, let's go back to the car. Ethan nodded slightly, not turning his back until Colin had stepped away. You heard her, he said. Walk away. Colin's eyes darted between them. You think the law's gonna believe a couple of senile old fools and some washed-up soldier? Ethan's jaw tightened, but his tone didn't rise. You'll be surprised what people believe when they finally see the truth. For a long, taut moment, the storm filled the space between them. Colin's face twisted again, rage giving way to something colder, darker. You haven't won, he hissed. I'll take back what's mine, the house, the money, everything. He turned abruptly, stomping back toward his truck. The door slammed hard enough to echo through the trees. The gray pickup fishtailed once before straightening out and disappearing into the swirling snow, its taillights fading like dying coals. Silence settled over the road again, broken only by the faint growl of Ethan's Ford engine and Shadow's steady breathing. The dog's fur slowly lowered, though his eyes remained on the horizon. Walter leaned heavily on his cane. He'll come back, he said softly. He always does. Ethan glanced toward the old man, then at the woman trembling beside him. Then we'll be ready, he replied. His voice was quiet but certain, the kind of certainty that came from years of facing storms far worse than this. Walter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. You remind me of someone I knew long ago, he said, the corners of his mouth turning upward faintly. A man who didn't talk much either, but when he did, he meant it. Ethan almost smiled. Those are the ones worth listening to. They returned to the truck, snow crunching beneath their boots. Shadow leapt into the back seat. circling once before lying down, his head resting on the armrest between the front seats. June sat quietly, her hands clasped, staring out the window at the white blur of falling snow. As Ethan pulled back onto the road, the storm seemed to ease slightly, as though acknowledging the confrontation had passed. For now. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain. Behind them, the darkness swallowed the last traces of Colin's truck. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end. Men like Colin didn't retreat. They regrouped. And when they came back, they brought more than anger. They brought paperwork, threats, and the cold cruelty of the law. Still, as Shadow shifted closer, his muzzle brushing against Ethan's arm, a quiet strength filled the cab. Walter's hand rested over June's. For the first time in years, the two old souls felt that someone stood beside them, not for obligation, not for pity, but for what was right. Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead, snow hissing beneath the tires. The war wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The motel room was small and smelled faintly of detergent and damp carpet. But to the Ellistons, it felt like shelter. Outside, the snow had quieted to a thin drizzle, soft flakes melting on the windows like sighs. Ethan sat at the small desk near the corner, phone pressed to his ear, his posture upright, the way soldiers sit even years after they're discharged. Shadow lay stretched beside the bed, his head resting on his front paws, eyes half open, every few seconds flicking toward the door as if expecting trouble. On the bed, June and Walter sat close together. June was wrapped in one of Ethan's spare blankets, her frail hands resting over her knees. Walter's cane leaned against the nightstand, its worn handle catching the yellow light from the lamp. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like waiting. Ethan's voice was low but firm. "Mark, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Elder abuse, financial control, physical harm. The kid's name is Colin Elliston. Another pause. "Yeah, I know. But this isn't just a bad family argument. It's systematic." Mark Rivera's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. His tone was gruff, touched by the easy confidence of someone who'd seen both combat and bureaucracy. "You always did know how to find trouble, Cole," he said. "You sure you're ready to wade back into this kind of mess?" "Ready or not," Ethan replied, glancing toward the couple. "They need help, and I'm not letting another predator walk away because the system's slow." Mark's sigh came through, a sound that mixed exasperation with reluctant admiration. "All right, I'll pull the records, check on Colin's financials, see if there are red flags, fraud alerts, withdrawals, title transfers. You said the grandparents are with you?" "They're safe for now." "Good. I'll reach out to Grace Dalton. She's been running pro bono elder defense for vets and seniors. If anyone can fight this on paper, it's her." Ethan nodded. "Tell her I owe her lunch." "She already knows," Mark replied dryly, and hung up. Ethan placed the phone down, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The exhaustion that crept over him wasn't physical. It was the kind that came from seeing injustice dressed up as care. Shadow nudged his knee gently, sensing the weight pressing down on his handler. "Yeah," Ethan murmured, scratching the dog's ear. "We're not done yet." A soft knock broke the quiet. June flinched at first, but Ethan was already moving toward the door. He opened it slightly and relaxed when he saw Lydia standing there. bundled in her thick green parka, a scarf wrapped around her neck. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and in her gloved hands, she carried a paper bag that smelled faintly of soup and fresh bread. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, her voice uncertain but kind. "I just thought they might need something warm. The cafe's closing early, and I had extra." Ethan smiled faintly. "You didn't have to, but I'm glad you did." Lydia stepped in carefully, brushing snow from her sleeves. She glanced around the small room, taking in the modest furniture, the old couple sitting quietly on the bed. "Hi again," she said softly, offering a smile to June. "Brought some vegetable soup and rolls. And..." She hesitated, pulling a folded sweater from her bag. "This belonged to my grandmother. I think it'll fit you." June blinked, her lips trembling. "You're very kind, dear," she whispered, taking the sweater with both hands. The wool was soft, pale blue, faintly worn at the edges. It was the sort of thing that carried warmth even when cold. She clutched it to her chest for a moment before slipping it on. "I haven't had anyone make me soup in a long time." Lydia smiled. "Then it's about time someone did." She ladled the soup into bowls, the steam rising gently into the cold air of the room. Walter muttered something about not deserving charity, but Lydia cut him off with a grin. "It's not charity, sir. It's Idaho hospitality." The room eased a little after that. June ate slowly, spoon trembling slightly, while Shadow rested his chin on the edge of the bed, eyes flicking between each person like he was making sure everyone stayed safe. Lydia crouched to pat him gently. "You're a beautiful boy, aren't you?" "He knows it," Ethan said, a ghost of humor flickering across his face. After a few minutes, Lydia straightened. "I'll leave you folks to rest," she said softly. "You all look like you've had enough of the world for one day." June reached out, gripping her hand. "Thank you," she said. Her voice cracked, and to her own surprise, tears welled in her eyes. "For remembering that we still matter." Lydia froze for a heartbeat, then squeezed June's hand gently. "You matter more than most people realize." Then she slipped out into the night, her boots crunching softly against the snow. Ethan stood at the door for a moment after she left, watching her figure disappear into the swirling white. There were still good people left in the world, people who didn't need to be asked before they cared. An hour later, another knock came, this one firm, confident. Ethan opened the door to find Mark Rivera standing there. Mark looked older than Ethan remembered, mid-40s, hair cropped short and streaked with gray, his frame still solid beneath a worn brown jacket. A jagged scar ran along his left cheek, disappearing into the shadow of a beard. He had the weary eyes of a man who'd seen too much of what the world does to the weak, but his handshake was strong, deliberate. "You don't age, Cole," he said dryly. "Still got that hero complex, though." Ethan smirked. "You came anyway." Mark shrugged. "Can't let you have all the moral credit." He stepped inside, scanning the room. When his gaze landed on June and Walter, his demeanor softened instantly. "Ma'am." "Sir." He nodded respectfully. "We're going to get you through this." Before Ethan could respond, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then handed it over. "Grace wants to talk to you." Ethan took the phone. "Grace Dalton." A clear, sharp voice came through. Her tone was precise, professional, and anchored with quiet strength. "Ethan Cole, I heard you pulled me into another mess." "Wouldn't call it a mess," Ethan said. "More like a mission." Grace chuckled lightly, the sound quick but warm. You always were poetic for a seal. Grace Dalton was 40, with a reputation for being relentless in the courtroom. A former Navy legal officer, she had left active duty after losing her husband, also a veteran, to an avoidable medical error at a VA hospital. Since then, she had dedicated her practice to defending those who couldn't defend themselves. She was tall, with chestnut hair cut neatly at her shoulders, and a composure that could calm a room or silence a bully with equal ease. "I'm driving up from Coeur d'Alene tonight," Grace said. "If they're willing, we'll start documenting everything tomorrow. Financials, medical, statements from anyone who's seen the abuse. We'll need photos of injuries and property records." "I'll have it ready," Ethan replied. Mark looked over from where he was unpacking a small laptop. Already pulled the first set of documents. Power of attorney transfer, bank withdrawals, and one fun surprise. The house title's been moved to Colin's name last fall. Walter's head dropped. "He promised that was just paperwork," he said, his voice hollow. Grace's voice hardened over the line. "That promise ends tonight." June reached for Walter's hand, squeezing it. "We shouldn't have trusted him." "You trusted family," Grace said gently. "That's not a mistake. It's hope. He abused it. That's on him." The call ended, but her words hung in the room like a quiet vow. Ethan looked around, at Mark working quietly on the files, at Walter and June sitting a little taller than before, at Shadow, curled by the door like a guardian. For the first time since this began, the air felt different. The fear was still there, but so was something else. Resolve. Walter met Ethan's eyes. "Feels like I'm back in a fight again," he murmured. Ethan gave a faint smile. Old warriors never really stop fighting. They just change what's worth fighting for. The next morning would bring forms, signatures, and strategy. But for now, in that small motel room surrounded by snow, there was peace. Grace's final words echoed in Ethan's mind long after the line went dead. From here on out, they don't fight alone. The morning broke gray and heavy over Sandpoint. Snow still lined the gutters, melting into shallow pools that reflected the dim winter light. The Ellistons sat quietly in the examination room of the small local clinic, waiting for the nurse to return. June's hand rested lightly on Shadow's head, her frail fingers tracing the soft fur between his ears. The German shepherd lay beside her chair, eyes closed, but his breathing was alert, slow, steady, protective. Ethan stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the frost melt from the glass. Mark Rivera leaned against the wall near the door, a clipboard in hand, while Grace Dalton spoke in low tones with the attending nurse. Grace was immaculate as always. Dark slacks, gray wool coat, her chestnut hair tied back neatly. There was an intensity in her movements that came from years of precision, her voice measured but commanding. "We'll need copies of every document," she said, "photos, notes, and your full report by the end of the day." The nurse, a woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and a kind face, nodded. "Of course, ma'am. We'll get everything processed today. Mrs. Elliston's vitals are stable. Some bruising on her arms and back, mild dehydration, but she'll recover." Grace exhaled softly, relief slipping into her tone. "Thank you." Ethan turned toward June. "You hear that? You're going to be fine." June smiled faintly. "I think I already am," she said, her voice trembling just a little. She leaned down to Shadow, whispering something only he could hear. "You're an angel, aren't you? A guardian in fur." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Walter sat across the room, hands clasped over his cane. He had the look of a man whose body was failing him, but whose spirit refused to yield. "You think they'll find what they need?" he asked. "They'll find more than that," Grace replied, gathering her papers. "The search warrant came through an hour ago. Sheriff's team is already en route to your property. If Colin's been hiding what we think he has, this ends today." Mark pushed off the wall. "Let's head over. I want eyes on it." The Elliston property sat at the far end of a rural road, lined with frozen birch trees. It was a modest farmhouse, 2 stories tall, with faded green paint peeling from the sides and a porch sagging slightly from years of neglect. A rusted mailbox tilted beside the driveway, its nameplate, Elliston, barely legible beneath a layer of ice. Sheriff Ben Harmon stood near the front gate, his breath visible in the cold. He was a man in his early 50s, tall and broad, with thinning blonde hair and a mustache streaked gray. His uniform was neat, the badge polished, but the deep lines around his eyes suggested a man who had seen too much deceit in quiet towns. Despite his hardened appearance, there was something deliberate in his manner, careful, methodical, and just a touch weary. When the black county SUV pulled up, he turned to greet them. "Cole," he said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. "Heard you stirred up a hornet's nest." "Just cleaning it out," Ethan replied. Grace joined them, introducing herself with the crisp professionalism of someone used to command. "Sheriff Harmon, we have the warrants, financial, medical, and property-related. Colin Elliston's name shows up on several unauthorized transfers." The sheriff gave a curt nod. "We've got officers securing the perimeter. My deputy found the back door padlocked from the outside. That's a red flag if I ever saw one." Inside, the air was thick with neglect. The heat had been turned low, and every breath formed a faint cloud. The wallpaper had peeled away in long curls. On the dining table sat an empty glass and an open envelope marked "Final Notice." Mark moved carefully, camera in hand, photographing everything. The unpaid bills, the overturned chair, the stains along the carpet where a heavy piece of furniture had once sat. Grace followed the sheriff upstairs. "We're looking for signs of restraint, anything suggesting confinement." The second floor smelled faintly of dust and something sour. The first door they tried creaked open easily, revealing an empty guest room, cold, unused. The second door, however, was bolted shut with a metal latch mounted on the outside. Grace's eyes hardened. "This is it." Harmon stepped forward, unclipping his flashlight. "We'll need to force it." With a single strike from a crowbar, the lock gave way. The door swung open, revealing a small bedroom with 2 twin beds pressed against the wall. One was neatly made, the other rumpled. A tray sat near the corner, an unfinished bowl of oatmeal hardened into gray paste. Grace crouched beside it, examining the room's only window. It was nailed shut from the outside. Harmon whistled softly. "Guess we found our locked doors." Grace straightened, her voice quiet but firm. "He kept them in here." Mark entered behind them, camera flashing. "You can still see where the cane scratched the floor near the bedpost," he said grimly. "He locked them in every night." Downstairs, another officer called out, "Sheriff, you'll want to see this." They descended to the small office near the kitchen, a converted storage room lined with file cabinets and scattered paperwork. On the desk sat an open laptop and a digital recorder. Harmon pressed play. Colin's voice filled the room, sharp, slurred with alcohol, shouting, "You think you can tell me what to do in my house? You're lucky I feed you at all." A crash followed, then the faint sob of June's voice. The tape hissed, went silent, then caught another snippet. "You sell that land, and I'll finally get what's mine." Grace's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "That's enough," she said quietly. The officers continued searching. They found a folder marked property sale, pending, detailing a plan to sell the Elliston home to a development company with forged signatures on the contracts. Another folder contained power of attorney transfers and insurance claims filed in Colin's name, all signed under false pretense. Mark exhaled slowly. "That's everything we need." "More than enough," Grace said. "He's done." By the time they stepped back outside, the sound of tires crunching over snow signaled another arrival. A patrol car pulled up beside the property. Colin was in the passenger seat, hands cuffed in front of him, his face pale but defiant. His eyes darted to Ethan and the others standing by the porch. "You think you're heroes?" he spat. "This is my family, my house." Ethan didn't answer. Grace stepped forward instead. "No, Mr. Elliston," she said evenly. "It was theirs. You just forgot what that meant." Colin lunged slightly, but Harmon's hand on his shoulder stopped him cold. "Save it for the judge," the sheriff said, guiding him toward the back of the car. The metal cuffs clinked against his wrists as he was pushed inside. The door shut with a final thud, sealing years of cruelty behind glass. Ethan watched the patrol car disappear down the road, red and blue lights flashing across the snow. Behind him, Walter stood next to June, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. "It's over," he whispered. "Finally over." June's eyes filled with tears. "For the first time in years," she murmured, "I believe that." Shadow sat beside them, tail flicking once, before he leaned gently into June's leg. She smiled, stroking his head, her voice barely above a breath. "You really are an angel in this winter, aren't you?" Ethan turned toward the fading lights of the patrol car, exhaling a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Justice," he said quietly, "comes slow, but it comes." Spring came slowly to Sandpoint, as though the town itself was afraid to believe in warmth again. The snow along Harbor Lane melted into ribbons of silver water that ran down the gutters, feeding the first stubborn shoots of green grass. The lake shimmered at the edge of town, its ice finally gone, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wet soil. It was the kind of morning that whispered renewal, the kind Walter and June Elliston had not dared to hope for in a long time. The small courthouse downtown had been full that day, weeks earlier, the light filtering through high windows onto faces lined with judgment, pity, or quiet admiration. Colin Elliston had sat at the defense table in his wrinkled shirt, his arrogance finally wilted. The evidence had been too clear, too overwhelming. The forged signatures, the bank records, the recordings of his rage. Grace Dalton's voice had carried through the room like tempered steel, sharp but controlled. "This is not a misunderstanding," she had said. "It is the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable, and today, it ends." When the verdict came, June wept openly. Walter didn't move at first. He simply stared at the judge's lips, as if afraid to believe the words he was hearing. Restoration of property, rights to Walter and June Elliston, the judge had declared. Protective care assigned under state supervision, and a permanent restraining order against Colin Elliston. Now, months later, their house no longer felt like a prison. The locked doors had been replaced. the nailed windows open to let in fresh air. Ethan had helped with the repairs himself, installing handrails along the staircase, recarpeting the hallway, fixing the loose floorboards that creaked underfoot. His hands, steady and calloused, worked with the same patience he once used to field strip a rifle in silence. Shadow followed him everywhere, nose dusted with sawdust, tail wagging whenever Walter gave a quiet order. Walter had regained a spark. Though age still bowed his back, there was strength again in the way he held himself. He wore his old flannel shirts now, clean and pressed. Sleeves rolled past his wrists as he sanded a wooden railing under Ethan's guidance. "Guess I still remember how to hold a hammer," he said one afternoon, squinting toward Ethan. "Just needed someone to remind me I wasn't done yet." Ethan smiled faintly. "You never were." June spent most mornings in the kitchen, sunlight spilling over her as she baked. Her silver hair was always pinned neatly in a bun. Her pale blue sweater, the one Lydia had given her, still soft from careful washing. Every Friday, she baked oatmeal biscuits shaped like small bones, which she stored in a tin labeled "for Shadow only." "Dogs have better souls than most people," she often said, placing a biscuit in the tin while humming softly to herself. Sometimes, Lydia stopped by from the cafe, carrying a thermos of coffee and gossip from town. Her face was bright with youth and a quiet admiration for Ethan that she never said aloud. She would kneel beside Shadow, scratching behind his ears, and laugh when he leaned his full weight against her knees. "You're getting spoiled, soldier," she'd tease. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled into the driveway. The driver, a middle-aged man named Harvey Lowe, with a round face and sun-faded cap, stepped out holding a package marked Dalton Law Group. "Special delivery," he said, handing it to Ethan. "Looks official." Inside were the final settlement papers and a short handwritten note from Grace. "Case closed. Justice served. Now live, don't just survive." Ethan folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He could almost hear Grace's voice, sharp, witty, endlessly composed. She'd called him 2 nights before, saying she was taking on a new case for a veteran's widow in Coeur d'Alene. "You've done your part," she had said. "Now let them do the rest. Healing doesn't happen when you're still standing guard." He wasn't sure he agreed, but he understood. The following week, Ethan and Shadow arrived early one morning with lumber and paint. The lake glimmered behind the house as mist rose from its surface. Walter met them on the porch, his cane tapping lightly against the newly polished boards. "You don't have to keep fixing things, son," he said. "We're holding together just fine." Ethan looked at the railing, half smiling. "Not fixing. Finishing what we started." Shadow trotted past them, heading straight for the kitchen where June stood waiting with her tin of biscuits. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, bending slowly to scratch behind his ears. "You know what day it is." She opened the tin. The dog's tail thumped against the floor like clockwork. She handed Ethan a cup of coffee, her fingers warm against the mug. "You know," she said softly, "it's strange to have quiet mornings again. For years, quiet meant fear. Now it means peace." Ethan nodded, glancing around the home, at the sun filtering through the clean windows, the faint scent of baked bread, the photographs restored to their rightful places on the mantel. "You earned that peace," he said. Walter sat in his armchair, polishing a small wooden whistle he had carved himself. It was clumsy, but charming, the kind of project a younger man might have given up on, but an old one found purpose in. "Watch this," he said, bringing the whistle to his lips. A soft tone emerged. barely audible, but enough for Shadow's ears to perk instantly. The dog padded over obediently and sat at Walter's feet, waiting for the next command. Walter chuckled, his voice deep with satisfaction. "See that? Still got it." June laughed gently from across the room. "You and that dog," she said. "You two might start a club." Ethan smiled. He listens better than most men. They all laughed at that, the kind of laughter that rolls out gently, like sunlight on still water. Later that day, Lydia arrived with a basket of muffins and the latest newspaper. "Your story's in here," she said, unfolding the front page. The headline read, "Elderly Couple Wins Justice After Months of Abuse. Veteran and K-9 Team Credited for Intervention." June covered her mouth, eyes wide. "Oh my." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "They didn't have to print that," he murmured. Lydia smiled. "Maybe they did. Sometimes people need to see that good still wins." The afternoon slipped into soft gold. Shadow lay sprawled near the porch steps, his fur shimmering in the light, breathing steady. Birds sang somewhere in the birches. Walter leaned back in his chair, his old eyes distant but peaceful. As Ethan turned to leave, June reached for his sleeve, stopping him. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Son," she said gently, looking up at him with eyes clear and kind. "Sometimes God sends salvation not with wings, but with a soldier and a loyal dog. Thank you for seeing us when the world decided not to." Ethan swallowed, unable to speak for a moment. He simply nodded, his throat tight. Shadow stood beside him, pressing lightly against his leg. June's smile deepened. "Take care of each other. You've given us back our life." As Ethan and Shadow walked down the porch steps, the morning sun broke through the clouds, scattering over the thawing ground. Behind them, laughter drifted from the open window. The snow was gone now, and in its place, the first green blades of spring glowed against the soft earth. Shadow paused, looking back once, then trotted forward beside his handler. Life, at last, was warm again. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the form of a man who refuses to look away, and a loyal dog who still believes the world is worth protecting. What happened to the Ellistons is more than a story of justice. It's a reminder that God still works through ordinary hearts, through kindness offered when no one is watching, and through courage born from love. In a world that often feels cold and divided, this story calls us to see one another again, to listen, to care, to stand beside those who have been forgotten. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below. Subscribe for more stories of faith and compassion. And may God bless you and all those you hold dear.